Welcome to State of Wellbeing, a podcast from South Dakota State University. The State of Wellbeing is a holistic well-being podcast with the goal of supporting the campus community as we strive to be a growing, high-performing, and healthy university. Welcome to State of Wellbeing. I'm Caitlin Walters, the Wellbeing Specialist, and this episode I'm joined by
Bruce Johnson.
Thank you so much for joining me, Bruce. We're excited to continue our financial literacy, financial wellness series, and we thought that this would be an appropriate time to talk about roommates and sharing expenses with roommates, living with roommates. So I wanted to kind of bring you in and just discuss how we can better share our expenses with our roommates and maybe work through some of those conflicts that arise when you're living with a roommate. I think this is applicable both to students who are maybe graduating and moving off campus, or maybe students who are maybe preparing to move off campus but continuing to come back to school.
Sure.
And maybe they're picking out roommates for the first time that won't be living in a dorm setting for the first time in their lives. So to start, would you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and what you do here on campus?
Yeah, I've taught different business classes since 2012. A week ago, somebody asked me that, and I was like, I don't know, I've been teaching for 5 years. I'm like, no, it's been 12 years. So anyway, taught for 12 years, business classes, personal finance, personal selling, marketing, just a wide gamut. When I first started, I actually taught graduate finance courses for my alma mater, and really got into the number crunching, and that was my thing. I always wanted to sort of calculate and figure out what's optimal. The problem is, the older I got, the more I was teaching classes, especially selling. We deal with negotiations, conflict resolution, doing all of that. I've just had to accept that it's not about the numbers. It really is about the people and the psychology of what's going on there. So one of the questions that you had prepped me with was discussing, are there any apps out there? And I knew of a couple. I didn't know there were about 10 or 15 out there that students could use to help split the money. The conflict that happens has nothing to do with the dollars, or usually doesn't. I mean, if you're out of money, then you have a problem. But the conflict is usually rooted in maturity. And that's where we usually find the issue. So
yeah,
anyway.
I think that's really great point to bring up. I also was doing a little bit of research prepping for this, and I found a study that said that the main pet peeve or main conflict that arises is around cleaning was number one. And then the second one was poor communication, which I think comes to a little bit of what you're saying
there it is,
as well.
Yep.
And 71% of folks who are living with a roommate prefer to have those conversations in person,
Sure.
Face to face, which maybe you can have some recommendations on how we deal with the conflict, and maybe we can get to that in a minute. But certainly conflict is something to expect, or even just some like pet peeves or annoyances is something to expect when living with roommates. And I like that you say it's not just about the numbers.
No.
It comes down to that maturity and communication.
Exactly. So in this personal selling class, I realized that about only 20, maybe 10, 20% of the students are actually going to end up doing selling. But a lot of the techniques that are used in there and discussed in there are communication techniques. That's all it is. It's trying to develop trust with someone else so you can actually learn what's going on with them, what their thinking is. And we really don't know how to do that as much as we used to. So it's learning how to do that. But then I thought to myself, well, how can these young people learn how to develop this with somebody else? So the first question you ask is, well, where are most of the conflicts students have? Roommates. And so what we do in this class is we turn those conflicts into a case study. It's like a laboratory. So the student will come in and say, okay, well, I want it this way, they want it that way. And then we apply a framework and then focus on, okay, all of these theories assume that you're dealing with two mature adults. And it's a long story. I had a counselor friend of mine ask one time about personality. And when you're talking about a marriage, do personalities, does that matter? Are there certain personalities? And I remember she responded to me and she said, Bruce, two mature adults should be able to get along no matter what. And it kind of ended discussion. And that stuck with me. So I realized that that's the issue. It's maturity. So most of us, when we're trying to get what we want, we perceive ourselves as the center of the universe. And when you do that, we've all seen kids do that, it doesn't end well. It's usually you create conflict, you're willing to step on other people's toes. So it's how do we create a situation where a student almost, or a young person, having a roommate gets excited. As dumb as that sounds, they get excited because they're going to use this to practice techniques that they can use in the future with their spouse. They can use it with their employer. All throughout your life, all of us know as adults, we're constantly in conflict in one way or another. So it's as crazy as that sounds, it's get excited because now you can learn how this is used.
Well, and I would imagine that that's a situation where, you're living with that person. And so if you don't get it right the first time, and hopefully you don't, hopefully
exactly.
It's not so bad that it escalates. But if you don't get it right the first time, they're going to be there tomorrow or in 5 hours, and you're going to be able to come back and try again and kind of practice with that person. And you're both practicing together is the nice thing.
Well, and that's the thing. Hopefully if somebody would to listen to this podcast, it would be both the roommates to say, okay, well, maybe let's try to learn something here. This last year, I got to work with one of the fraternities on campus. I was an advisor for a couple years with them, and the young men that had asked me to be an advisor wanted me to teach the techniques I was showing in class. And I thought, I wonder why they want to know this stuff. And it hit me. They're in constant conflict. They have 50 guys living under one roof. They have 4 guys per room. You're in constant conflict. So for them, they wanted some tools at their disposal so they could kind of get the emotion out of them and use their logical brain, not their lizard brain. How do we resolve this conflict and move forward? Well, once they learn that again, then they do it with their significant other, then they do it with their employer, and then they do it in other places. So it's used, the tools that I use and that would be used in marriage counseling are the same tools that are used by the United States Institute of Peace to train negotiators at the State Department. It's the same tools. So it's called the Thompson-Kielman Conflict Resolution Instrument, if anybody cares. And it just figures out what's your dominant conflict style. All of us react out of emotion. So if, for example, well, let me ask this. If you're in a conflict, out of these 5, how do you normally react? Do you avoid the conflict? Do you try to fight to get what you want? Do you let the other person get their way? Do you try to compromise, or do you try to collaborate?
I would say probably collaborate.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think it's about 15% of the population are collaborators. Collaborators that's the best one. So we have 2 different ways we can handle conflict. You have distributive, which is the compromising, avoiding, accommodating, and then competing. But collaboration is integrative. And what it can do for the person is step back and say, are you in a position where it's zero sum, where you have to win, therefore they have to lose? And most of the scenarios we're not in that environment. If you're I think that last year a student said, well, maybe if you're a litigator in a divorce proceeding or something, that's a distributive environment. But most other environments, the relationship is important, so you want to work to figure out how do we get what we both want. But again, our emotions flare up, and now we want to, my dominant style is compete. I try to fight to get what I want. And I remember somebody said to me one time, they're like, Bruce, sometimes you just got to fight to get what you want. I'm like, no, I need the opposite. That's terrible advice for me because I always do that. I need to figure out a different way to handle this because if my wife or whoever, it's not working. I'm getting what I want, but I'm still losing. So anyway.
Well, and I think to younger versions of myself, certainly there were some other versions of that, right?
Yeah,
it was avoidant or just letting the other person win no matter what, you know, and I think it is interesting to think of, I haven't heard that breakdown before, but just that you do eventually progress. And that was time. It was living with roommates. It was, living on my own for a little while. It was, living with a partner. And it certainly changes over time when you've gotten more practice in it.
It's maturity. Yeah, you're growing through it and you realize, there's got to be a better way to do this than how I'm doing it. Yeah. Yep, exactly.
So I'm kind of a firm believer that it's easier to set expectations up ahead of time.
Yes.
Than to get into a situation. So if I'm moving in with someone for the first time, starting on the right page, And so what would you say is a good way to like start on that like right page with someone? If you're like, okay, we're planning on moving in together, we have the space picked out.
Yep.
What should I do before we get into the house together?
So this, I thinking about these questions, I thought, well, here's the logical answer. And then I thought, well, here's my real answer. So the logical answer is, first thing, both parties write down everything you own. Okay, don't go into that where it's, oh, I don't remember if that's hers or that's mine or what's going on there. Write it down, and then is kind of awkward as it is, it's like a prenup. You say, okay, this is my stuff and there's your stuff. Last year, a young lady was talking to me about doing this, and what happens is usually you have one more aggressive person that's or not aggressive might not be the right word, but they're going to do that. They're going to write it down. So while they're writing it down, she wrote down her roommate's stuff. And then she sat down with the roommate and said, okay, what is this yours and is this mine? And then had him sign it. So they're in agreement. Yes, that's what's going on there. And I forgot the first part or the second part of your question there.
Really just kind of like, again, like you said, like you're starting off with on the right page about your expenses.
Yep, there it is.
And so we have our things that we own. Maybe like, what would you suggest as far as like, okay, what are we going to talk about with shared expenses?
Yes, yep. So typically the three shared expenses that most roommates have is the rent, the utilities, and then house items like toilet paper, those types of things. Those, I think it works best most of the time, and obviously there's exceptions to every one of these, but it works best to just split it 50-50 or based on some predetermined percentage, however you're going to do that. Most of the time you're going to want to split it equally. There might be circumstances where you have a person that's, I way back in the day, had a neighbor of mine in an apartment who he was making a great living, but he just wanted a little extra money at the end of the month. So he offered up to have a roommate, and the roommate paid him $50 a month or something to live there. That was predetermined. Both parties are in agreement on that. Other than that, usually you're going to want it split equally in equal thirds or fourths or halves or whatever. And then it works best if you say, okay, do we agree to this? Have it written down, and then have both parties sign it. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to tell you, yep, that's a binding contract or isn't a binding contract. But it's establishing that both parties agree this is what we're agreeing to.
Well, and I think, I had this question later on, but I think it fits actually better here. But when we're thinking about moving in with someone, I do think there is a compatibility piece, not just when it comes to like, shared interests or like common, do you get along? But it's also, are you compatible financially?
Yeah.
And is that going to make sense? Does your roommate potentially have these different lifestyle or different habits? And is that going to work with your financial lifestyle and habits? And anything you would want to add to that?
And that's probably the most challenging one because we all have, I call it a financial self. Where we grew up, oftentimes we treat money either the same way as our parents or the exact opposite of our parents. It's usually nowhere in between. And there's other factors. So before I came here, there was a test I used to use online and would have students take, and actually couples would take it, is a money spending personality test. The best one here recently I found is, I don't know if this is good or bad, but it's the California court system. They have a free online test that you take, and you get one of 5 dimensions. You're a spender, you're an amasser, you're a money hoarder, a money monk, who is someone that enjoys giving money away. It makes them feel well, and then a spender. So you have those types. What you want to watch out for is if you have a spender and an amasser, those are like diametric opposites that you're going to struggle with that one. As long as though there's an agreement and that person, the spender's spending money on whatever they want, as long, again, as it's paid in the agreement, as you agreed, then hopefully you won't have issues. You don't want to judge what they're doing and how they're doing it because that's going to get you nowhere. That's a maturity thing again. But there's these 5 different types, and you do want to ask, well, how does this person look at the world differently than me? So one rule that it drives me nuts, and we hear it all the time, is the golden rule, is do unto others as we want done unto us, right? Human beings default to that. When I'm dealing with my wife or talking with her, I automatically treat her the way I would want to be treated. But when I found out when we got married, My wife doesn't like to be treated the way I would be fine being treated. She wants to be treated differently than that. So then it's my job to learn what that is. If I want to build trust with her, I have to learn what she wants. And that's kind of the enlightenment of all this, is to understand other people are different. That's fine. You're going to deal with that your entire life. Learn how they're different and learn to appreciate that difference. Maybe you wouldn't do it that way, but if it's just a roommate, hopefully you don't have to do it for years and years and years.
Yeah, I think I asked that question and it immediately brought to mind my brother and I lived together. He was still in college and I was out of college, and it does get a little interesting when you're living with siblings or family.
Yep.
But I remember he was still in college and I had just graduated, and so financial status was just a little bit different. But I remember we were setting up our apartment and we had our utensils, and I said, I'm going to go to Walmart and get one of those utensil holders.
Yeah. Oh, like 90, to put in a drawer?
It was like 99 cents for the drawer.
Sure.
And he said, no, I don't think we should be spending money on that. And he was trying to suggest that we just put our utensils in Ziploc baggies.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's that like, oh, there's a little bit of conflict there. And finally it was like, well, I'm just going to pay for it myself then.
Yep.
And when we leave, I will take that utensil holder with me and it'll be fine. And guess what? I still have the utensil holder. But it's that like a little bit of compromise and a little bit of, that's fine, I'll pay for it myself and you can use it.
That's the perfect way how to handle that. I did that with a million years ago when I had a roommate. I bought the couch, I bought the vacuum cleaner, the microwave, and everything. When we left, everything was mine. He didn't care. He was fine that he didn't have to spend the money on that, and that was kind of the agreement. One I ran into here a few weeks ago was a young three gals living in the same place, and they were talking about buying furniture together and each putting in a third or a fourth to buy it. And I'm like, oh goodness, don't do that. That will not work out, because at the end it's like, how do you split it? It just doesn't work. So other than the rent, the household items like the toilet paper and maybe cleaning stuff, rent, utilities. Other than that, it's usually preferable that one person is exactly like you did with your brother. You buy it, you pay for it, and when you leave, it's yours. You bring it with you.
What about groceries?
Okay, that's an interesting one. I thought about that before I came here. If you're going to do groceries, and again, it's just dependent on the situation. I would advise, though, most roommates, buy your own food. Don't go in with others. And the reason I say it, especially if you're talking college students, most of them are working. So, or they're busy or they're doing other things. So you're not eating supper at the same time or breakfast. And in that case, it's what's yours is yours. Put initials on the milk jug or whatever, and then just eat what's yours. In that rare circumstance where you'd have, I don't know, I can imagine maybe like a group of guys that work on a construction crew together. Well, then maybe you want to try to negotiate that and split it in equal halves. The problem is, just like your brother, what ends up happening is one of them, as they're sitting down and eating, is one person eats like 3/4 of the food and everybody else eats a smaller portion, and then they're upset that they had to pay for the same amount. So
I think that's great advice. Is it better, so when we're talking about, maybe rent or one of those bigger, utilities, is it better to have one person pay it and maybe we try to split it on, on a splitting app or something like that,
Yep.
or, a payment app? What would you recommend when it comes to like sharing cost across people?
So there's obviously many options. One would be, in a great world, maybe the one that sort of has the highest earner would be able to pay for everything, and then everyone would just pay that person to simplify it. Other than that, I would advise using an app. You can just Google what are the best roommate apps for personal finance, and you're going to find 10 or 12 of them. Probably 5 are very dominant. Off the top of my head, Splitwise is a good one. Venmo. A lot of folks have Our Groceries. That usually focuses on groceries, and then IOU and Splitter. Those are 4 main ones that are pretty good. They work pretty well for it. So. And
I remember when I again moved into a house with 2 other roommates, and I created a spreadsheet and I shared. We were all on the same spreadsheet. We could add to it, and it was just a reminder of who was paying what, and things were highlighted. And I was probably the only one that used the spreadsheet, but I liked having it just for my own tracking sense. But it's nice that they have apps these days that probably do pretty much the same thing.
That's actually what happens with a lot of personal finance stuff. I'll have students that they have created their system when they're 15 years old. They still follow their system. So if that's the case, then don't get an app for it. Just keep doing what you're doing. In a perfect world, you would have one roommate that is like that is meticulous and wants to track that stuff and write that stuff down. And however you can make it work, it'll work. So, yeah.
So when we talk about, we have talked a little bit about this, but when it comes to these conversations about, hey, you're drinking my milk, or, this doesn't feel like we're sharing it evenly, how do we make those conversations less uncomfortable or less awkward?
So the biggest thing to remember when you're in a situation like that is you don't control them, you control you. So, and what you can control usually is your reaction and how you handle it. So if you're like me, I would get frustrated and upset at that. First thing I would do is go on a walk. I need to cool off a little bit. So again, when I'm trying to communicate with this person, and again, depending on what they're like, if they're a introverted, quiet person, if I'm going to broach that subject, I'm going to talk a lot lower. I'm going to be like, hey, the milk the other day, you were kind of drinking straight out of the bottle. That was mine. And if you hopefully your roommate's honest enough to say, oh, whoops, sorry. And it's like, okay, well, it was an honest mistake. I make mistakes all the time. Let it go. The big issue is when you have a roommate that you are oil and water. And how do you bring this up? And actually another unfortunate thing that can happen is if you're both highly competitive, because then it turns into an argument. And then if you're in like an apartment building, now everybody can hear the argument because walls are usually pretty thin, and which causes follow-on issues. But most of the time it works best if you can get your emotion out before you confront them, because people are far more receptive when you're calm, you're soft, you're saying, you're not, no wisecracks, no sarcasm. Those are, and if you're married, you know that. Like you try that for a couple of years and you're like, wow, this does not end well. So start now. Start it with the roommate. Figure out how do you solve, conflicts the adult, mature way.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this in a couple episodes, but when we are having that conflict, starting with those I statements and not saying, you always drink my milk, or you're never paying this, and this. It's always, how does it, I feel, some sort of way when this happens.
Exactly.
And trying not to say, especially the you always can be very triggering, because they're like, no, I don't know. This time I did that. They'll think to the one point to prove that it's not always. And then they're not listening because they're defensive.
I've been told when you say you always or you never, those are fighting words. Because realistically, nobody always does something, or nobody never, that's just not real. Now, maybe it is. There's some example out there, but for the most part, it's not. So get that out of your vocabulary. And exactly what you said, stay away from the targeting and here's the deal. I feel frustrated that you drink my milk. How do we handle this in the future? But keep it cool, calm, and talk about, how you're feeling and those I statements.
I wonder too, so we talked a little bit about living with family, and I did pull a statistic that 47% of adults are living with, 47% of adults who are living in a shared household are living with their parents.
Oof.
And so I wonder, we're talking about roommates.
Yeah.
What happens when your roommates are your parents?
Yeah.
Do you have any insight on financial sharing or any of that when it comes to parents?
There are times I think I see a lot of students, they graduate and then they go home for a couple of years because they're finally making enough money to pay off their student loans and that type of thing, and get started on a fresh foot in life. One thing to remember, if you are living with your parents, whose name is on the title of the house or the mortgage, and whose name is not on there. And remember that okay, you maybe don't like their rules, but at the end of the day, they own this. So they do have that little piece of control. Like any situation, it's the same thing as having just a regular roommate. Is you don't want to create a war. You want to have peace. You all want to be able to function. You don't want the relationship to go to hell in a handbasket. You want to work through that. And then the question is, well, how do you do that? And how do you learn how to do that? And it's not easy. So it doesn't matter. I think once you're in your 20s, whether your parent, it doesn't matter. They're another human being. They're another person, and you're obliged to treat them with respect, no matter who they are.
Well, and I think, taking on, maybe you are living with them to save money, and I think that that's perfectly normal and perfectly reasonable. But maybe, helping take on some of the groceries, or, not just living there. I think I lived with my aunt and uncle during college, and so not my parents, but they were very generous, and they let me stay with them. And I was in an internship, so I wasn't making any money at the time, a free unpaid internship. And the understanding before I moved in was, we're not charging you rent. We just want you to live here. You can help with cleaning, and you can help with cooking and things like that. And that was the agreement. And then once I finished my internship, I did actually start contributing because I was making a little bit more money and I could help. But I think it also helped set up, okay, well, eventually if I want to move out, I am going to have to make monthly rent payments.
Yes.
And so it kind of helps with practicing. And so even if I wasn't paying them, trying to put that somewhere where I'm like, okay, I'm getting used to the habit of paying into this rent fund. But just being able to identify there are ways for me to contribute to this roommate relationship, even if we have an agreement that I'm not paying rent.
Yeah. So that one thing comes to mind when you say that about the paying rent and getting used to that. One of the things we find with college students, couples usually, is they graduate from school, married, and we call it dinkhood, dual income, no kids. And some folks are utterly shocked because they've never made this kind of money before. And if schooling was largely paid for and maybe all they have is a mortgage payment every month, you all of a sudden got some real money here, and you're like, oh, let's go to Tahiti. Let's have some fun with this. And I'm not saying don't go on vacation, but remember, if you decide to have children, everything goes back to law of averages, and you're going to have expenses there. So just as you said, start getting used to that now. You're always going to have probably a rent payment or a mortgage payment. The chance that you won't is very slim. You're always going to have to eat. You're always going to have food, clothing, shelter. You have to have those things. So be prepared that a lot of that income goes towards those things. Yeah.
So this kind of goes back to the having those awkward conversations, but do you have any advice on maybe holding some of those financial boundaries with your roommates and still getting along with them?
So when you say financial boundaries, what are you thinking?
I wonder, I think it's, maybe agreement on shared expenses, maybe not going over those shared expenses, or maybe it's getting to that point where if you have already said, we're going to share groceries, and then you're realizing that the other person has different preferences in meals and they're spending more money. Maybe how do you go back to those, okay, no, we're going to share these again? Sure.
Another boundary I thought of is, well, what happens when one of them, let's say there's three, and one of them's not making the monthly rent payment? So how do the others deal with that? And I'd love to say that there's, just do this, but there's not. You're going to have to deal with the unfortunate conflict and say, look, there's three of us here. We each have to pay equally. If you're not paying, then one of the things I would do is, I ask my kids, what do you think should be the natural consequence to this? And not paying rent, the natural consequence is, well, you need to leave, and we're going to go find someone that can pay rent, because that's the way that is. But again, that's so much easier said than done.
Well, I think it can be tricky too, because we're talking about sharing expenses equally, but I've seen situations where someone has a larger room, and so they pay more, and other people pay less. I've also seen situations where one person is living with a couple, and that couple is splitting the couple's expenses, and the other person, and maybe one person in that couple's not paying the same amount. And what happens when, like you said, what happens when one person isn't kind of meeting those expectations?
You're going to run into those all over the place. Actually, when I was younger, that's what happened with a roommate and I. I had a room that was probably 30% bigger than his. So then I paid an extra $50 a month because I had the bigger room, and that's what we agreed upon. The trick with any of this stuff, if you dive into it, it's the psychology of it. It's Well, why two people can usually figure out how to do a lot of different things and can agree on a lot of different things. But if your emotions are building up and you're getting frustrated with this, then you're not seeing the 50 ways you could try to address that issue. Maybe it's, well, if one of them is not paying the monthly rent, maybe you can come up with an agreement that, okay, next month they pay 80% of the rent, and because maybe they'll have money then, or they could sell something. There's other ways to deal with it, but when you get charged and frustrated and now you're angry at your roommate because they're not doing their part, we narrow our focus and we lose all those options. So it's, again, and you don't control your roommate, you don't control your spouse, you don't control it, you just control you. So the thing you can control on is your reaction and how to find the optimal way to handle that so to get the outcome you want.
Well, and kind of like we started, I think it's a lot easier to set those boundaries ahead of time.
Sure. Yep.
Than when you realize, oh, something's not working, and now I never told them that I didn't want this that I didn't have this boundary,
Yep.
or that I had this boundary, and now I have to tell them we've been living together for 6 months, and that can be extremely awkward.
Oh, yeah.
And so just setting yourself up for success by really laying out expectations, and then I almost think about, what if we treated it like you do at work, where we're going to schedule a monthly meeting,
Sure,
and we
sure.
just sit down and we debrief and we share, if somebody has
Yep.
not a grievance, but if somebody has something they want to talk about, and like you said with the introverts, I think of this too. When I set meetings for folks, I really like to make sure they know what to expect in the meetings.
Have an agenda.
Yes, because
Yep.
if for someone who really likes to think about it ahead of time and know what's coming at them. So maybe it's, we're gonna have a meeting, and here's some of the things that I want to talk about. Is there anything you want to talk about?
Sure.
But just kind of almost treating it like almost in a business way, where it's, we have this relationship, and
Yep.
we're gonna treat it in a professional way almost.
Absolutely. The more people you have the more you have to do that, because you have to have an organized, methodical way of dealing with that. Because let's say you have 5 or 6 roommates. I don't know, that's illegal in Brookings, but let's just say, you need to come up with some organizational structure here, because you have 6 people that have 6 different wants and needs. And so it's try to do it ahead of time, try to talk about it before it happens. And maybe have a weekly 10-minute check-in or monthly or what have you.
Any other tips for navigating conflict, or any other tools or resources that you wanted to talk about?
The apps were really the big one that I would encourage, especially, again, we see young people typically are either very organized, as you were saying, you already have a spreadsheet, you're already doing this, and if that's the case, keep doing it. But if you're not like that and you're not as organized and you're not, you don't monitor your bank account maybe as closely as you should, consider the apps, because the apps automate it, and then you're just looking, oh, whoops, yep, got to get rent. And Venmo has one, for example, so then you now have a tool to use to actually pay the other person. So very effective. So I would encourage you, if you don't have anything and you do have roommates, use one of the apps. If you're blessed enough to have a roommate that is organized, let them organize it then. If that's not your shtick, let them do what they do best.
I think another resource that I always like to talk about is the Student Counseling Center. If you are having struggles
Sure.
with your roommates and you are a current student on campus, going in and talking to them, they have even mentioned that they can mediate conversations
Sure.
between roommates. And so if you're having a conflict and both of you want to have your sides heard and you want to have a counselor there to kind of facilitate the conversation, that's a great option as well.
Yep.
Anything else?
I think that's mostly it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. We really appreciate your time today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Today's processing questions are: how can I navigate conflict and difficult conversations with a roommate about shared expenses? And what is one tool I can use to track shared expenses? Thank you for listening to this episode of State of Wellbeing, a podcast from South Dakota State University. This podcast is brought to you by the Mental Wellbeing Team and SD State Health.